All right, y'all, we're heading out of St. Francisville. We're going north to the great state of Mississippi.
That's right.
Now, I got to tell you something. We've never been there before.
That's a lot.
This is all new to us, as new as it is to you. So I hope you enjoy the risks we take for you as tour guides.
James is joking, but not joking at the same time. So our town is right by the border with Mississippi, and we do pass over it regularly. There's actually all kinds of stuff to do right across that border. We're going to Natchez, which is the oldest town on the Mississippi River, and it's not a place where we've spent a lot of time. It's kind of a natural successor to the trip that we're doing, so it's definitely something that we want to share with y'all. But we're going to be going there as, dare I say it, tourists. We'll see how that goes. So it's going to be new to us, so we're going to be sharing places as we discover them. Whole different approach than we've had in a lot of
Y'all
years.
get to see us raw.
God.
That's it.
Hopefully not too raw, not so much that it stings, but
Right.
we'll see.
We're tracing like old shipping routes, really, backwards.
Yeah, so like St. Francisville, which we're leaving from right now, was a port town. Natchez was also, it's like one of the biggest ports on the Mississippi. They were a lot closer together back then. And both of them are towns that were pretty sizable in their day, but are considered very small today because they haven't continued to grow the way New Orleans and Baton Rouge have. But yeah, we're going to be seeing the leftovers of a place that was a real hub of its era.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I'm excited.
Me too. And we'll get into, there's both water trade routes and land trade routes. The Natchez Trace is something you might have heard of, and that'll be part of our adventure up there, is getting into what it's all about.
Yeah, if you guys want to tour this part of the world by bike, I recommend you train and don't come in the summer.
Oof.
It is too hot.
Yeah,
in the
we
summer.
said things were all flat in New Orleans, but once you get up here, you're in hill country.
We are in the hills of Feliciana and about to be in the hills of Mississippi.
Y'all, for our first stop, just getting into Natchez, we wanted to stop and learn about the mound builder sites out here. So we have a historic site called the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, just off of the highway as you come into town. And we went to the mound sites in Baton Rouge, but there are tons of these in the region. The Visitors Center here can give you a map of a whole trail of them that runs through Mississippi and another one through northeast Louisiana. So these sites are everywhere, and in fact there's several just around Natchez itself. So if you were curious about this subject, you could visit this one, which was inhabited at the time of French colonization. You can visit the Emerald Mound, which was the previous site of residence for the people who lived here. And there's also one that's referred to as Anna site, which is nearby. Mostly they were disused by the time French colonization happens and by the time written records and drawn records were with us, but this is the one that was inhabited when French colonists came along. So we are going to learn about what was going on here at the time when French colonization was in its really early days.
It's amazing to me, especially just coming out here and seeing all this open land. And I can only imagine seeing these people out here just surviving with their mud made and just local flora here. They build their houses out of the local mud and the local things that are growing here. And you can picture it, like just seeing them out here just living their lives, and these gorgeous mounds are just jutting up out of the earth. And all these trees probably wasn't even here, but can you imagine just like there's a creek right there and just coming over the horizon and seeing these mounds here and then seeing these tribes of people just running around and living their lives, and all the lost culture that they must have had and all the lost like traditions. And we only have bits and pieces of the information just thanks to historians and archaeologists.
We mentioned in Baton Rouge how the mounds were not always used as the base for anything, whereas it's known that these ones had buildings on top of them, and also that this site was still in active use at the time of French colonization, and there were people who kept written records, which is one of the reasons why we know more about this, because we have the benefit of some writing about it, albeit from the French perspective. And there was both alliance and eventually enmity between the French and the Natchez, as well as other Native American groups in the area, such that warfare eventually wiped these folks out. But along the way, there was a sort of friendship between one of the surveyors who set up the French Quarter in the first place, this guy Lepage du Pratz, and one of their family leaders here, which is a guy whose title was Tattooed Serpent. So there's actually a story of where an individual sort of emerges from this otherwise pretty anonymous group that we don't know much about from the inside. So there's a little bit of a sense, whereas so much of Mississippian culture and the culture around these mounds is mysterious, we get a little bit of clarity with this particular site, and it's still preserved right behind a bunch of people's backyards. So it's this kind of nicely hidden little sacred site right in the town of Natchez. So not an easy thing to spot necessarily when you're coming in, but definitely a priority for us.
It's also definitely worth it, especially around this time of year. Springtime right now, there's wildflowers everywhere,
Yeah, it's
which you'll be able to see. There's all different colors of plants, and everything is really pretty, really beautiful. Definitely a must stop if you're heading up in this area and actually see where Natchez, Mississippi actually got its name from the native peoples that actually used to live here.
So we are by one of the 3 mounds they still got preserved here out of 6 that stood here at one time. So we're gonna go check out the other ones. Y'all, before we go, we're swinging by the 3rd and last of the visible mounds today, a pretty overgrown one that's slowly eroding into the stream that runs behind all this. The site, it seems like what we can learn here is mostly about the Natchez of bygone times of the 18th century. And while that's really enlightening in its way, a little bit of extra reading reveals that, you know, things that I wish I knew in the first place, that this is still a living people, that folks were relocated forcibly from here to Oklahoma as part of the Trail of Tears, and also over east to the East Coast. And so that you do have people who still identify Natchez today, and who still organized groups of people who continue some of the culture and even the language that would have been spoken and lived here at one time. So those are things that it takes a little extra digging to figure out, but that is always something we want to do when we come to these sites, is look a little bit beyond what the curation of the site tells us. So a lot more there to learn, but visiting this place encourages us into some first few steps. Pungent. Can't tell if I'm imagining that it has a smell or not. Y'all, before we get into town proper, we also wanted to make one other little detour outside of Natchez to the Natchez Trace Parkway, and we'll nickname this the Purple Parkway today because it's covered in wisteria, these beautiful dangling purple flowers that this time of year are a big fixture. And this is like, if you know certain pieces of New Orleans history, this is a little bit of a pilgrimage, because the Mississippi, of course, was a huge trade route, and people getting to New Orleans were at the end of a long, long trek sometimes, coming from different parts of the Mississippi Valley, bringing their goods downstream. And like, people today, when they picture Mississippi River traffic, it's really easy to focus on the steamboats, but that stuff was the high end. The low end was like real ramshackle little flatboats that made the trip down and basically just used the Mississippi's current and were not self-propelled at all. So when you got to New Orleans, you were halfway through the journey, but you were through the easy half, because then you sold whatever you had spent the year farming, and then you sold your boat, which you could not take back upstream, and the wood from that would be used to make houses in New Orleans. So a lot of the housing stock in New Orleans comes partly from wood from up in like Illinois and stuff. So speaking of Illinois, one person who made that journey would have been Abraham Lincoln as a young man a couple of times. And when he did that, and when all of his peers did that, you had your little time in New Orleans, and you spent a ton of the money that you'd just made having a wild time in this city where you could, so still had the kind of Bourbon Street character that it has now. But then you would make your way back up the river, usually on foot. So you started along the river itself, and then when you got to around here, you used the Natchez Trace from there on out, which went over to Tennessee. And it was super old, possibly natural trails made by wandering animals that were also used by Native Americans, lots of different nations that lived along this stretch, but came to be also used by European American traders. And there was a pretty good chance of getting mugged along the way too, along with the natural arduousness of it. So this was a tough corridor, but it's been, a version of it anyway, has been paved for a nice long time. And if you're looking to explore the region via, say, a road trip, like this is a great way to do it and to get off of like the big modern highways a little bit and get a slightly more nature intensive view of the thing. So
that's amazing. And also the tie to New Orleans, like that's just, y'all love us, don't you?
Like we mentioned, this is like this is a logical other end of a pilgrimage that begins in New Orleans, and so while you could go a lot further, you know, this is final point for us, but definitely recommend y'all give this an exploration.
We've accidentally found this spot. Forks in the Road Historical Site. This is actually a slave port, an old slave port. And as you can see, there's nothing here at all. And probably because through time, if there was anything left, the descendants probably burnt it all down or something like that, just to get rid of the memory. But we did discover a voodoo reference here. But before I get to that, this was the second busiest slave port, I think, in the United States at one point.
Natchez in general, yeah.
Natchez in general, yeah. And there's a lot of descendants still living around here. And this slave history is kind of emotional for me, just simply because I'm a descendant. And I brung this up before, you know, a lot of people say we should be over it, we should get over it. And then you read the signs that are here and you can't help but feel something. There's an interesting thing over here on one of the plaques where they're talking about the different skin color of the slaves that were sold here. And they actually list them as either yellow, if the person's skin color was lighter, brown, black, if they were dark brown, like, which is what my complexion would be considered. And a story that most people don't know is that my sister, my actual blood sister, her name is Christy, and she was in you and James's class. She's a lighter shade than me. Same mom, same dad. People thought like we look almost exactly alike. The only difference is she's a lighter shade. And in history, it just so happens that if you have a female slave who was lighter skinned versus a darker complexion, she was considered to be a high yellow, I'm quoting, she's considered to be a high yellow Negro. She would then be sold to whatever slave owner would be here at the market, and then she would become a house slave. So they would have her hair in pigtails with the little red ribbon. She would have on the apron. And then once she made it to the plantation, whatever their theme for the house slaves was on the plantation, because each plantation had a theme for their house slaves depending on what they looked like. She would discard her clothes. They would give her the clothes that they wanted her to wear. And she probably would spend the rest of her life inside of the house, either tending to the master and his children or cleaning the entire house. Now, she may have children that she may have had that are darker complected that may have been sold to a plantation not too far from here. She would never see them ever again. On the record here, there's a list of slaves who were for sale. They were like 4 months old, 6 months old, 3 months old. Some of those kids, their parents probably were already sold to another plantation. Probably would never know who their parents are ever again. I would be considered I can't say it on camera, but I think y'all get it. I would be considered a field N-word because of my darker complexion. And I'm also tall. So I have more stamina. They would put me out in the field to pick cotton or to pick the sugar cane. And then in Mississippi, it was more cotton than sugar cane versus in Louisiana. And the life expectancy of a slave that probably had my build, because they have the heights there, and there's a lot of them close to 6 feet, they probably didn't live past 25, 26 years old. And that's actually typical on the plantation. We're disposable. So they could come back here to the slave market, buy another young slave, work them. If they got sick, if the slave owner choose to, he would take them to the little slave hospital not too far from here on St. Catherine. And if they could take care of them, they would. If the slave died in the middle of the night, they took the bodies out. Slave owner got informed. He came back, bought another slave, and replaced the one that actually died. So I'm actually glad that there's nothing left here. There's just a spot to commemorate. Like this is where it happened. But any remnants left behind, I probably would have burnt them up myself. Oh, wow.
What you got?
Look.
Yeah, they had them over there too.
Oh, this is plantation voodoo.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, please, no, tell us about it.
Wow, this is to let you know that there were priests and priestesses that were actually sold here. That there's a family of descendants who know that the ancestor was here. They were sold from here, and their family still practices.
Gotcha.
Wow, that is a big piece. This is a nice discovery to cover up all this depression. What?
That's pretty cool.
Holy crap. So usually we leave the African cowrie shells are left to signal somebody like me who's walking past, like, hey, there's a priestess in the area, or there's a family nearby that may live in one of these houses that actually is part of plantation voodoo. If there's something wrong, there's a safe spot. Go look for the signs in front of the house.
Gotcha.
And there's specific signs like this that you see in concrete sometimes around that let you know like there's a safe space here somewhere. Holy crap.
And another kind of great surprise when we came here was learning that this site very likely was used as a barracks for former enslaved people who ended up joining the Civil War on the United States side and contributing to the war effort. And this is something we talked about a little bit on our bike ride up the Mississippi. And in that case, we got into the story of Andre Caillou, this guy from New Orleans, who became this kind of tragic hero at the Battle of Port Hudson. But on the plaques you can read here, they also tell the stories of other battles in which free people of color or formerly enslaved people got to play an instrumental role and survive to see it. And that those victories could have been directly beneficial to them in the coming years of their lives. So it doesn't always have to be a tragic story. So much of the time it is, and that's what I think a lot of times we struggle to tell a story that feels like it has something of a happy ending in this genre, but once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while we always get that one little piece of like, ooh.
Yeah.
And to see like some of these people actually fought for their freedom and earned it. And the descendants are here. And it's really depressing talking about slavery, as y'all probably know already, especially for someone who looks like me. But it's the fact that that struggle happened, and there's these monuments, and then you see that these people who are enslaved, ex-enslaved, were fighting for their freedom on the right side, because we did win, and able for me to become childhood friends with the cameraman in this one here, so we can actually tell you this story. Because if they didn't do what they did, I wouldn't be here doing this right now.
Amen.
Amen. Ashe.
Y'all, we made another detour to go check out the local cemetery.
We're good at detours. That's mostly what we do, really.
We're decent at cemeteries too. I feel like we're cemetery fans.
We do like cemeteries.
I shouldn't speak for all of us. Roby, do you like cemeteries?
Yeah.
We are middling to up on cemeteries. This one's huge. There's a little bit of South Louisiana style above ground burial here, every here and there, but it's built into some hills, and so you get a lot of variety, some big opulent mausoleums and then lots of in-ground burial. We're looking for a couple of spots that are particularly well known here. So there's there's an angel whose eyes are supposed to follow you as you walk by, and then there is a monument here, very much like one in our hometown, that has a below ground portion with stairs that would allow somebody to go down and visit the person buried there, something done by a mother for her child who was afraid of storms. So that's what we're hunting, but we're seeing lots of cool stuff on the way.
I think we go this way. The map seems to be a little confused about where we are.
Y'all, as we find it, we learn we are far from the only people looking for this. So this is the grave of Florence Irene Ford, and we can see the marks of many past visitors. So the story here is of a girl who died at 10 years old who was badly afraid of storms, and her mother would always comfort her in life when one happened. And so in death, her mother had her buried in a pretty standard way, but with this stairway going down with a glass wall so that she could access or see where her kid was and go and keep her company when a rainstorm came in. Crazy act of devotion for someone to venture out into this cemetery. It's way far from the gate. We walked for quite a while to get here, so Mom would have been taking a walk through many a rainy morning and afternoon and night. But a lot of people are still coming here, and we see toys from some of the latest movies, so this is another really active pilgrimage site today. All kinds of stuff. Like, this is a place people will put some real thought into. Yeah. Y'all, after making the circuit through things surrounding town, we are finally in downtown Natchez. We're gonna walk around and explore. Even from what we've just already seen, it's kind of an architecture fan's paradise. There's lots of different stuff to see. Things from more south than here, things from more north than here. Tons of styles. We won't go on too long about it, but watch and see what you recognize. Y'all, as we're exploring downtown, we're also finding some interesting references that are worth some deeper digging into the lives of specific people here who kind of illuminate the Black experience in the neighborhood around the Civil War and the times that follow. So we've got, to name a few, the experience of William Johnson, whose house we are next to. This is a free man of color who was here before the Civil War and who worked as a barber and kept a diary. And so it's a picture of local life here and kind of a literary legacy pre-Civil War. And in terms of writers from here, we've also got Richard Wright, who's a novelist who was the grandchild of enslaved people. And so born in the area around Natchez, ended up writing a lot of stuff, memoir and fiction, that reflected experience lived here. And then finally, a really remarkable story that I heard about this place, where a fellow named Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, who was a North African prince, enslaved pre-Civil War, found his way to Natchez, and then was eventually liberated from slavery at the request of the Sultan of Morocco to the federal government in the US. This is a really unusual case of somebody who found their way into slavery or forced into slavery getting a kind of amnesty from on high. This didn't happen a lot, but this is one of the few places. Yo, we started our trip into Natchez at some mounds, and now as we get to the home stretch of our visit, again, mounds. This is a very different set of mounds. Nothing to do directly with, it's not Native American construction, but it has a lot to do with Native American life here. So, mentioned on the way in that Natchez is the oldest settlement on the Mississippi of European colonists. So it predates New Orleans by a couple years. Fort Rosalie was built here in 1716, a couple years before the 1718 founding of New Orleans. And so you're looking at one of the really early footholds of the French in this region, although there are others still older down on the Gulf Coast. I should say this was actually built by the Natchez Native Americans, just not for the Natchez Native Americans. So an original peace arrangement between the French and the Natchez, who were aristocratic and had low-level laborers in their own society. It resulted in Natchez labor building Fort Rosalie for the French, and ultimately, when the French and the Natchez came to blows, this was where much of the conflict centered around, along with the Grand Village that we saw earlier. So This is the origin point of Natchez and everything around it, one of those first footholds of French culture and French colonization in the region, and also the work of people who knew their mound building all at the same time. It also ends up being very briefly in British hands as well as Spanish hands. We told you all about West Florida down in St. Francisville, so this was also one of the points of defense of West Florida. The British failed to hang on to it, and an attack here was ultimately what put West Florida into Spanish hands.
It's funny how like the catalyst of things like kind of start balls rolling for a whole bunch of stuff, because the way this all started was Native Americans were actually trading with some of the French colonists, and at one point just turned all their guns on the French and just shot them all, scalped some of the women, killed some of the children, and also more importantly, they took some of the children and the women as slaves, talk about the Native Americans, and also some of the West African slaves. Some of the West African slaves actually took the opportunity to fight with the Native Americans to earn their freedom during that battle. So that just spiraled a lot of things in many different directions as far as like the Native Americans, the French, also the whole thing was just a whole bunch of just chaos. And here we are standing behind the remnants of said chaos.
And we could do a whole presentation on Native American enslaved African relations. That's a huge, complex subject unto itself, but suffice to say, them banding together for a small revolution here was one of many stories of that kind. Moments when people worked together, moments when they did not so much.
There were moments in history where they were pitted against each other. There were
Totally.
moments in history they worked side by side and then went against each other. Some of the Native Americans were actually sold to Haiti. Some of them were sold to slavery on the plantations. Some of the West African slaves betrayed the Native Americans and betrayed them to the French. And then the French took them and enslaved them. Don't get me started.
Most of this has now fallen into the river, so if you're exploring, as we just were, through downtown on foot, or if you're driving in via a visitor's center that's right at the edge of town, you might come by this. It's super easy to miss, but it's the origin point, and this is all that's left. For the last of our walk through town, y'all, we've come down from the elevated riverfront to the low riverfront, and this is going to bring us into the old port section of town. We really like to compare things to our very own French Quarter, which, like this, is a riverfront port town, and y'all either firsthand or secondhand know the mischief of the French Quarter. Apparently this was that part of town at one time, the disreputable part where all the flop houses and grog dens were located. So we've come down to find a grog den. Yeah, you really get the feel as you walk through Natchez today that it's very much a like historical society, Daughters of the American Revolution kind of town. But it's nice to think that it had like a kind of raunchy flip side at one point.
I love it because it's like, you know how in the French Quarter back home in New Orleans, you have like this part of the French Quarter, which is residential. Then you have this part of the French Quarter that is for big businesses. And then there's that dingy, just like that nasty, dirty water on the ground front part of the French Quarter that I like to rub all over myself. Part of the French Quarter. I don't really rub French water.
PG-rated video.
I'm sorry. I had a moment. Roby had a moment. But anyway, this is it. And you can even tell like this is it because We walked the entire time in the historical part of Natchez, right? And right by the river, way down at the bottom, away from all the historical stuff, you find grunge. You find filth. You find history of prostitution. That actually happened down here. Like, that's actually part of the history.
It's pretty cleaned
Gambling,
up grunge these days.
it's cleaned up now, obviously. I'm exaggerating, but this is it. Like, Andrew's telling the truth. This is it. Like, this is the party spot. Like, this would be our Bourbon Street.
I even see Go Cups.
There's
so
Go Cups.
We're
like,
right
that
at
should
home.
tell you everything. This is home. I feel good.
So we are making our last steps into the part of Natchez called Under the Hill. All right, y'all, we've walked onward from under the hill with our ill-gotten plunder, and we are just about level with the water of this river that has been our companion the whole way. This is the zenith of the trip for us.
And we tired.
we biked a lot. We saw a bunch of plantations. We went through our old stomping grounds of Baton Rouge and St. Francisville, hopefully shared with y'all some places you'll want to see, and we got to discover some new stuff for ourselves.
We
in
started
Natchez.
with the river and we ended with the river. Ain't that something there? Wet drinks. Gotta always have a piece of home with you.
And so, in the spirit of this, y'all, we would love to know any further thoughts you have. This road trip is something like we would love to do more of. If y'all have enjoyed what you've seen, you can always shout out your destinations to us. This is the way to explore so much of America. So we are certainly open to repeating the thing. Let us know what you thought and throw those comments down underneath along with anything else you think of. If you know Natchez, if you know any of the places we've been, I think folks will appreciate your thoughts on those destinations in case they themselves are planning to do some version of the trip that we've just done. So please share any insight that you have down below.
Please like, please subscribe, and also please ring the little notification bell so we know that y'all will be watching us whenever we drop more future videos.
And if y'all want to support the enterprise too, we got collective tipping information down in the description below as usual. So, cheers to making it all this way.
Salud fue, bon voyage.
And we will see y'all again back in New Orleans ever so soon. Paris, but yeah, you know, imitators here, and mostly it's supposed to be couples. That's how I hear tradition talked about, and you write something on it, which, you know, just invites retribution.
Yeah.
D&D Luther. Let's find them.
They have the key.
True love, unexpected. Amanda and Josh, forever.
Poor man then Josh.
It was good while it lasted.
Yeah. What you don't know is that Josh left for another man.
Can't count on straight people to stay together.
I'm good. Y'all, we don't normally come this far north. There's a lot of hazards here.
We're used to flat things.
Yeah, there's too many hills. I almost rolled my ankle there.
The joints are not calibrated for this kind of topographical tomfoolery.
No, this is too far north for any God-fearing human. I'm hoping one of these antique stores has sandwiches, because it seems to be all there is.